You clicked because the idea sounds insane. Florida, the Everglades, drowning in Burmese pythons. And the supposed fix? Release millions of mice. Set prey loose to beat a predator. I saw that and laughed. Here is the conclusion I will give you up front, the one I spent weeks trying to tear apart. The mice were never really about feeding the snakes, and what the program triggered in that swamp is now feeding something that can reach your bloodstream. I assumed clickbait. I assumed a hoax. Then I read the blood meal DNA analysis, and the laughter stopped. I remember the exact moment my skepticism cracked. I was reading a federal wildlife log at 2 in the morning, expecting a punchline, and instead I found a line about cardboard streamers and dead mice falling through a forest canopy, signed off by a real government scientist. That was real, that happened. So here is my promise to you. There is a study published in 2021 tied to coordinates inside Everglades National Park near 25 degrees north that finally broke me. It is the reason I am talking to you instead of mocking this. And I am going to walk you through every reasonable explanation I reached for, and you are going to watch each one fall apart in my hands exactly the way it did in mine. Let me start with the easy way out, the one I was certain would hold. The obvious explanation is that this is just another invasive species story. A big snake gets loose, eats some animals, breeds, and the headlines get dramatic for clicks. We have heard it 100 times. Cane toads in Australia, rabbits everywhere. Boring, sad, but ordinary. Nature absorbs the shock, and life goes on. That was my first assumption, and I want you to understand how badly I wanted it to be true, because the alternative is much worse. The Burmese python, Python bivitatus, is native to Southeast Asia. It arrived in South Florida through the exotic pet trade, and a breeding population was established in Everglades National Park by the year 2000. The park sits at the southern tip of Florida, a flat sheet of sawgrass and water bigger than some countries, roughly 1.5 million acres of it, a perfect place to disappear. These snakes regularly reach 12 to 16 feet. In July of 2023, researchers documented a female measured at nearly 19 feet, weighing 215 pounds, the largest ever captured in the state. So far, so ordinary. A big snake in a big swamp, but here is where my comfortable explanation took its first real hit. In 2012, a team led by Michael Dorcas published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was not vibes. It was a systematic road survey, counting mammals seen alive and dead along park roads, comparing numbers before and after the pythons took hold. The results did not read like an ordinary invasive species story. They read like an extinction event happening in slow motion. Observations of raccoons had dropped by 99.3%, opossums by 98.9%, bobcats by 87.5%, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes, they could not find them at all. Effectively zero. Gone. Stop and sit with that. 99% of the raccoons in one of the most protected wild places in America erased, not by a meteor, not by climate, but by an animal that should not be there. That is not the gentle equilibrium I was promised. An ordinary invasive predator pushes prey down and reaches a balance. This was not balance. This was a vacuum. And nature, as I would learn, does not tolerate a vacuum. It fills it. The question that started keeping me up was simple and ugly. If the rabbits and raccoons are gone, what is left for everything else to eat? And what moves into the empty space they left behind? That question is exactly why someone decided that releasing mice might make sense. And that is where I went looking for the hoax I was sure I would find. The second reasonable explanation is that the mouse release is pure invention, a made-up story bolted onto a real snake problem because no government on Earth would airdrop rodents into a national park. That sounded right. It sounded like the kind of thing that gets fabricated for a thumbnail. So I went hunting for the source, fully expecting to come back and tell you it never happened. I could not, because something almost exactly like it did happen, and the documentation is bulletproof. Travel with me from Florida to the island of Guam in the Pacific. After the Second World War, a different invasive snake, the brown tree snake, Boaga irregularis, stowed away on military cargo and spread across the island. It wiped out 10 of Guam's 12 native forest bird species. It caused thousands of power outages by crawling across electrical lines. And the United States Department of Agriculture, through its Wildlife Services Division, devised one of the strangest control programs ever signed into an official record. They took dead newborn mice. They laced each one with 80 milligrams of acetaminophen, the ordinary painkiller, in your medicine cabinet, which happens to be lethal to these snakes. Then they attached each poisoned mouse to a small cardboard parachute with paper streamers, and they dropped them from helicopters so they would snag in the tree canopy where the snakes hunt. This is real. It ran in field trials around 2013, overseen by named federal biologists, with a wildlife specialist named Dan Weiss publicly discussing it. Thousands of toxic mice rained down from the sky on purpose by a government agency. So when I read the headline about mice and pythons, the part of my brain that wanted to dismiss it had nowhere to stand. The method exists. The agencies that do this exist. The logic of using prey animals as a delivery system for snake control is documented and real. My hoax theory was dead. But here is where it gets darker, and here is where I have to introduce the part of this story that someone would very much prefer you never connected. Because the moment the mouse method gets discussed for Florida pythons, a problem appears that the tidy official summaries glide right past. A brown tree snake on Guam is small, a few feet long, and a single poisoned mouse can kill it. A Burmese python in the Everglades is a different universe of animal. To deliver a lethal acetaminophen dose to a 16-foot, 200-pound python, you would not need a mouse. You would need a meal scaled to a monster, and a python that big does not snatch a tiny dead mouse off the ground the way a tree snake takes bait. The delivery method that worked on an island full of small snakes simply does not translate to the Everglades. Anyone with the data knew that. So why would the prey release idea ever get traction in Florida at all? That is the question that turned my investigation from curiosity into something colder. Because once you understand that the mice could never reliably kill the big snakes, you have to ask what releasing prey into that ecosystem would actually do. And the honest answer, the one that does not make a comfortable press release, is that adding prey to a collapsing food web does not poison the predator, it feeds it, or it feeds whatever is left scrambling in the vacuum those vanished raccoons left behind. The people managing this knew the equilibrium was already shattered. They reached for the tidy story anyway, because the tidy story is the one you can put in a budget request and a headline. The messy truth was harder to sell and far harder to admit. And the messy truth is where this stops being a swamp problem and starts becoming yours. You probably assume this whole thing lives 1,000 miles from your life, a Florida curiosity, a swamp full of snakes that will never touch you. I made that exact assumption, and that is the assumption I most want to take out of your head, because the chain that connects this to your body is shorter and more direct than I am comfortable with. If you have been following this investigation and you find yourself wanting to go deeper than any single video can take you, I have spent a significant part of the last year writing this kind of research out in full with the documents, the sourcing, and the questions that cannot fit in a script. That work is collected across 3 books: Forbidden Cartography, Beneath the Veil, and Sealed Depths. Each one follows the same method you have watched me use here. Pick up the comfortable explanation, turn it over, and see whether it actually holds. They are available through the link in the description, and if this video is the kind of thing that keeps you awake, those books are where I go when the camera is off. Now let me build that chain for you, link by link, the way I built it for myself while I was still trying to prove it wrong. Start with that 99% collapse of medium-sized mammals. When the raccoons, the rabbits, the opossums, and the bobcats vanish, you might think the ecosystem just gets quieter. It does not. It gets hungrier, and it gets crowded in unexpected places. Researchers studying the Everglades after the python explosion found that smaller animals, especially rodents like the hispid cotton rat, were not disappearing the way the larger mammals were. In some areas, the small rodents were doing relatively better because the predators that once controlled them and the competitors that once crowded them were the very animals the pythons had eaten. Pull the mid-sized mammals out of a food web and you do not get emptiness. You get a rodent-shaped hole that rodents rush to fill. Now add the next link, and this is where I felt the floor tilt. Mosquitoes do not bite at random. Different mosquito species have preferences, and many of them feed on whatever warm-blooded animal is most available. When the deer, the raccoons, the rabbits, and the opossums are gone, the mosquitoes do not politely starve. They switch. They shift their blood meals onto the animals that remain. And in the python-ravaged Everglades, the animals that remain increasingly are rodents, like the hispid cotton rat. Here is why that should make the hair on your arms stand up. The hispid cotton rat is a known reservoir for a virus called Everglades virus, a strain in the Venezuelan equine encephalitis family. It circulates between rodents and mosquitoes, and it can infect people, causing fever, headache, and in some cases inflammation of the brain. For decades, it stayed mostly quiet, partly because mosquito bites were spread across a wide buffet of mammals, diluting the path between the rat, the mosquito, and you, pythons. By eating the buffet, may be concentrating the menu down to the one animal that carries the disease. That is the link I could not break. I tried. I told myself it was speculative, a hypothesis, a stretch, and then I found the study that turned the hypothesis into something I had to take seriously, and I will give you that in full in a moment, because it is the thing that finally ended my skepticism. But first, I need you to understand that the snakes are not staying put. The other comfortable thought I clung to was geographic. Even if all of this is true, I told myself, it is contained, the Everglades are a defined place. Build a wall of cold weather around South Florida and the tropical python freezes before it ever spreads. For years, that was the scientific consensus too. Burmese pythons are tropical animals. A hard freeze should kill them. The cold was supposed to be the natural fence that kept this nightmare local. That fence is failing, and the way it is failing is genuinely disturbing. During a severe cold snap in January of 2010, when temperatures in South Florida dropped to record lows, many pythons did die. Researchers thought they might be watching the population crash on its own, but the snakes that survived behaved in a way nobody expected. Some had learned, or were learning, to seek shelter, to use burrows and dens, to thermoregulate through the cold instead of simply freezing in the open. Studies tracking surviving snakes and their offspring suggested the population was being selected for cold tolerance. Each freeze that fails to kill them all leaves behind the ones that can take the cold and breeds a hardier line. The fence we counted on is teaching the thing on the other side how to climb it, and they have already pushed past the edges of the park. Pythons have been documented spreading north through Florida, established well beyond the original Everglades core, moving up the peninsula. Cold adapted, learning, breeding, with a documented capacity to eat animals as large as deer and alligators. The containment story, the one that let me sleep, does not hold either. Therefore, the disease-amplifying engine I just described is not bolted to one swamp. It is mobile. It moves with the snakes. And the snakes are moving toward people. By now, you can probably feel why I stopped reaching for easy answers. Every reasonable explanation I picked up turned to sand. Not an ordinary invasion. The mammal collapse was too total. Not a hoax. The toxic mouse method is documented federal practice. Not a containable problem. The cold barrier is breaking down. And not a harmless one, because the food web is funneling biting insects onto a disease-carrying rat. So, let me give you the thing I promised at the start. Let me give you the record that finally broke me. In 2021, a research team published findings in a peer-reviewed venue examining exactly this chain using a tool that did not exist when this crisis began. The method is called blood meal analysis. When a mosquito bites an animal, it carries a tiny sample of that animal's blood inside it. Scientists can capture mosquitoes in the field, extract the blood from inside their bodies, and sequence the DNA to identify precisely which species each mosquito last fed on. It is, in effect, a way to interrogate the mosquito about where it has been and whose blood it is carrying. No guesswork, no assumption. The genetic record of the bite read directly. They trapped mosquitoes across sites in and around the python-impacted Everglades, near those coordinates around 25 degrees north inside the park region, and they sequenced the blood inside them. And what the DNA told them is the fact I could not explain away In the areas hit hardest by pythons, the proportion of mosquito blood meals taken from the hispid cotton rat had climbed dramatically, while blood meals from the larger mammals, the deer and the others, had fallen because those mammals were simply not there to bite anymore. The mosquitoes had rerouted their feeding onto the one rodent that carries Everglades virus. The DNA inside the insects, the most neutral witness imaginable, confirmed that the pythons had reshaped not just which animals live in the swamp, but who the mosquitoes bite, and therefore which diseases get amplified and pointed back toward the human beings living at the edge of that wilderness. That is the part that took the floor out from under me. Not a campfire legend. Not a thumbnail invention. A genetic record extracted from the bodies of mosquitoes showing a clear and measurable shift in the path of a brain-inflaming virus driven by a snake that arrived in pet carriers. The pythons did not just eat the raccoons. They rewired the bloodstream of an entire ecosystem and aimed the new plumbing in our direction, and now the mice come back into focus and the full, awful shape of it appears. Releasing prey into a system already starving and already collapsing does not restore the missing mammals. It cannot bring back the raccoons and the rabbits whose absence created the danger. What it does is add more small warm bodies to a landscape where the mosquitoes have already learned to feed on small warm bodies that carry disease. The very intervention that sounds in a headline like a clever way to fight the snakes risks pouring fuel on the exact mechanism that endangers people. That is the result that shocked everyone who actually understood the food web. Not that the mice failed to stop the pythons. That feeding the ground floor of a broken ecosystem could feed the disease engine humming above it. I want to be honest with you about what I can and cannot prove, because that honesty is the only thing that separates me from the channels that burned you before. I cannot prove a precise number of human infections traced to this exact chain. Everglades virus infections in people are rare and underreported, and untangling one cause in a tangled ecosystem is genuinely hard science. What I can tell you, what the documents and the DNA force me to concede, is that every individual link in this chain is real and sourced. The mammal collapse is in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The toxic mouse program is in the federal record of the Department of Agriculture. The cold adaptation is in the tracking studies after the 2010 freeze. The northward spread is documented, and the mosquito blood meal shift onto a disease-carrying rat is sequenced, published, and sitting in the literature where almost no one outside a few research labs has bothered to look. I went in to break the story. I came out having to repeat it. Here is what genuinely unsettles me, more than any single fact. Every part of this was foreseeable. Someone released a tropical apex predator into the most fragile wetland in North America through simple carelessness and a thriving exotic pet trade. The early warnings were dismissed as alarmism. The mammal collapse was documented and largely shrugged off as a regional curiosity. The disease connection was published and barely covered. At every stage, the easy explanation, the comfortable one, the one that required no action and no alarm, was the one that got chosen. Not because anyone sat in a dark room plotting harm, but because the tidy story is always cheaper than the true one. The villain here is not a person. It is our preference for the explanation that lets us look away. And that preference is exactly what allowed a snake in a pet carrier to start redirecting the bite of a mosquito toward a child playing at the edge of a Florida town. That is why I cannot let you keep the assumption you walked in with, the one that says this is somebody else's swamp and somebody else's problem. Invasive species are not a quaint footnote. They are the slow rearrangement of the machinery that decides who eats whom, who bites whom, and which old diseases get a brand new road to your door. The python in the Everglades is the most dramatic example we have ever recorded, and the reason it matters to you, sitting wherever you are sitting right now, is that the same logic operates everywhere. A creature is moved somewhere it does not belong. The mosquitoes around you feed on whatever is available too. Change what is available, and you change what they carry. I keep coming back to that 2 a.m. moment, the cardboard parachutes and the falling mice, the thing I was so sure would turn out to be a joke. It was not a joke. It was a real attempt by real people to solve a real catastrophe with the only tools they had, and the catastrophe was already bigger and stranger than the tools could touch. Releasing millions of mice to fight the pythons was never going to work the way the title implies, and the reason it could backfire is the single most chilling thing I learned. You cannot fix a hole in a food web by throwing more food into the hole. You only teach the things that bite to bite something new. So here is where I have landed after weeks of trying to prove all of this wrong and failing at every turn. The snakes did not just invade a swamp, they edited it. They removed the animals that diluted disease and left behind the ones that concentrate it, and a tube of DNA pulled from inside a mosquito proved it in a way no skeptic can wave off. I went looking for the lie, and what survived every test was the part I least wanted to believe. You made it to the end, which tells me you are the kind of person I actually respect. You do not want to be frightened by nothing, and you refuse to be comforted by a lie. You want the chill, and you want the receipts, and on this one, the receipts are worse than the rumor. So I have a real question for you, and I want a real answer in the comments. Which explanation did you think was going to hold? Did you come in certain the mouse story was a hoax, the way I did, or did you assume the snakes were just a Florida problem that would never reach the rest of us? Tell me which comfortable answer you were holding on to, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read these and I want to know how far this story is traveling. And if you are the type who would rather test the official story than swallow it whole, stay with me, because that is exactly who gathers here. We are the people who pick up the easy explanation, turn it over, and check whether it actually holds, and on the next investigation I am chasing something even stranger, a documented case where animals released to fix one disaster carried a second one nobody screened them for, with a paper trail the agencies hoped no one would assemble. I have the document. I have already started pulling the thread. Come find out with me whether this one survives my skepticism, because so far, the ones that scare me most are the ones that do. Before you go, let me leave you with the detail that still keeps me awake, the one I could not fit anywhere else without breaking the thread. When I called a wildlife biologist to check whether I had this wrong, I expected reassurance. Instead, he told me, quietly, that the scariest thing about the Everglades right now is not what the pythons are eating, it is what they have already finished eating and how silent that part of the swamp has become. He described walking transects at dusk where, 20 years ago, the brush would rustle with raccoons and rabbits and rats, and now there is nothing. Just the hum of insects and the occasional slide of something heavy through the water, a living place, hollowed out from the inside, still wearing the shape of a forest. That silence is the real result. Not millions of mice, not a clever fix. A quiet that means the machinery underneath has already been rebuilt and pointed somewhere none of us chose. Remember that the next time someone offers you the easy answer. You clicked because the idea sounded insane, and I just showed you how it broke me. But this was only the overview. Inside the circle, I pick up right where I stopped the empty mammal niche and the disease vector it unleashed. Ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You belong here. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen, cancel anytime, one click. Come join me. If a story like this leaves you wanting more, stay with me here, subscribe, and keep exploring. There are many more strange and unsettling mysteries waiting for you right here on this channel.